You're live.
Hello everyone, nice to be back. We haven't done MHTV for quite a while, have we? So since before summer, so it's nice to be back online again with the usual crew. Tonight I'm looking forward to hearing from Alexis Quinn. We've been connecting quite a bit, haven't we, Alexis, recently? And I know it's going to be a really interesting interview tonight. So before we go over to Alexis, I'll go over to Nicky first, who can tell you how to join in tonight.
Yep, it's lovely to be back with you all. If you want to join in or make any comments or ask any questions on X, formerly known as Twitter, then please use the hashtag MHTV. And if you want to just join in on the live stream, then we can see your comments there and I'll try and feed them in as we go. Thanks very much.
Lovely. So, Alexis, I know you've got lots of strings to your bow. So, rather than me introduce you, do you want to just introduce yourself and just say a few, just give us a bit of background, really, for starters?
Oh, thanks, Vanessa. It's really lovely to be here. So, I guess I was formerly a school teacher. I used to teach PE to 3 to 18s. And before that, I swam for Great Britain. So my sort of teaching subject was mostly PE. And then I had a bit of a crisis when my brother died and I had a baby, and was in hospital for 4 years, detained. And I went back overseas, carried on teaching after that. I escaped. And I've just recently retrained as a psychotherapist. But in that time, so for about 4 years, I've been working the Restraint Reduction Network here in the UK.
Yeah, thank you. So lots to unpack there, isn't there, really? I guess, I know we met a while ago, didn't we? Because we did a session for Sheffield Health and Social Care Trust, which was specifically, wasn't it, around restrictive practice in pregnancy. And I know we're doing a workshop, aren't we, as well, at the Restraint Reduction Conference Network in November. We'll get a little plug in there and we'll share the details of that as well. But yeah, going back, I guess, to the beginning of your story and some of your experiences, because I know when we've spoken before, it's pretty striking, really, and I guess chimes with a lot of what all of us have experienced working in mental health as well. So do you want to say a little bit about kind of how you became interested in these issues, particularly around restrictive practice, I guess, which is the crux of it, really, isn't it?
I mean, what was really interesting to me, Vanessa, was that when I had my daughter and my brother died, I was teaching in a grammar school.
Yeah.
And I went to the doctor and I said, I need some help. There's some things going on. And what was interesting to me was that as soon as those doors closed, I ceased being a teacher and a mother and a daughter and all of those things. And whereas before in my swimming, I'd been called passionate and determined, etc. As soon as those doors closed, I was this patient, and they required to fix my obsessive, rigid, sensory-driven acts of, X, Y, and Z. So for me, first of all, just a kind of cultural restrictive element, where you lose your subjectivity almost, and every kind of aspect of you is kind of analysed and recorded, and you almost become a set of data, a set of descriptions. So that was really interesting. And that led on then to I thinking about a lot about sort of psychological restrictive elements, just the building itself, that you can't go outside, that you can't necessarily access certain rooms, and the impact that has. I remember one of my first interactions with staff was I had to talk through this sort of hatch in the goldfish bowl to talk to staff to ask for something, and I remember feeling really degraded. Because I say, just the day before, I was teaching at a grammar school, thing. And I was spoken to, not in a rude way, but it was very clear that there was this power differential. So I think that, and that sort of, all of that kind of sets up this kind of psychological sort of restrictive element, that actually I'm a bit powerless. And then I think for me, main things, I'm an autistic person, it comes as no surprise, I'm sure, to viewers and listeners that, wards are noisy, chaotic, sensory driven spaces. They're not routine, they're not familiar. And so I was reacting to that as well. So I would get very, very overloaded. Then I would, become very distressed and have a meltdown. And then I would get restrained, 6 to 10 people, holding me down, injecting me with antipsychotics. And I'm 6'1". You remember when I was a GB athlete? I'm world strong. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So and so everything was very reactive. And that's another thing that I noticed. There wasn't much proactive kind of stuff going on, at least for me. Anyway, which I found helpful. There was lots, not that nobody was trying, everybody was sort of trying, but not really getting to the core of what I needed. And so I ended up spending a long time in seclusion, in long-term segregation, and for me, that was the most harrowing of the experiences, and has been the most impactful even to this day.
Yeah, it's awful. I mean, there's so much in what you've just said, really, isn't there? I mean, starting, I think, with just the sort of deficit model that we have really around sort of medicalizing people and not kind of looking at people's gifts and strengths, and as you say, you were working as a teacher and highly skilled and an athlete by background, and then going into the system and feeling like you lose your identity. That's really striking, isn't it? And then there's something about, from what you've said about person-centered care, isn't there, as well, really? That's at the heart of it as well, isn't it, I think?
And it's almost like staff are like already on the back foot, right? Because they're sort of constrained by this narrative. The ASD manifestation, the ADHD presentation, and then it proceeds to list loads of stuff you can almost copy verbatim. This is how we talk about people, accessing the community, accessing a social space, all of these kind of fluid intake, right? All of these ways that we start sort of talk, they're almost on the back foot in terms of connecting, in terms of our ability to like deeply connect with people in a meaningful way. There's so many barriers that need to be overcome to do that almost.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's interesting as well what you're saying about neurodiversity, because I think, certainly, like I trained in mental health nursing in the early 90s, and it's only really recently that we've kind of even really acknowledged, haven't we, neurodiversity in mental health. And I also think there's lots of people who have been completely misdiagnosed over the years. When I think back over my career, so many people that I've supported over the years that have been misdiagnosed with mental health difficulties, and often serious mental health difficulties, when actually it's more probable that it was neurodivergence that hasn't been recognized. So I mean, it's good that we've moved forward with that, isn't it? But I think clearly there's a long way to go, and certainly the sort of number of people who are trying to get diagnosed at the moment as well is awful, isn't it? But then I know I've had a few conversations, and I know we've talked before that when I worked in prisons, there was, a high number of people in prisons who, either were, diagnosed with ADHD or autism, or certainly, were wanting a diagnosis. And, sort of mental health practitioners really kind of struggling, especially if someone's not got a diagnosis. And one of the things that I always talked about to people was about just working with people in a person-centered way. It doesn't matter, does it, if somebody's got a diagnosis or not? If that's how someone identifies, it's about recognizing people's sensory and communication preferences and the way that impacts on people, isn't it? So I think there's so much in what you've just said that resonates there in terms of mental health, but certainly your experiences as well of seclusion sound, awful. And I know that that's, something that across mental health we're trying to reduce, aren't we? But as we've talked about before, it's still happening, isn't it, across services and across the system.
Well, I think what's really troubling about it is there's often this idea that because, wards are very busy, chaotic, sensory-driven spaces, that autistic people need, this kind of sensory deprived sort of space and area. And I think there's a misconception there, that actually it can be helpful. Long-term segregation can be helpful for autistic people because they can't manage the ward. Up there with a forced choice. You're ending up there with, would you like to stay in this sensory driven nightmare, which we know is very difficult for you? Or would you like, a social and sensory deprived poverty ridden space, which is going to be equally difficult, but perhaps in a kind of very different way. So I think it's about, you know, staff knowing and understanding that, you know, autistic people have, you know, sensory needs, and it's about getting the right input, not no input. You know, low arousal doesn't mean no arousal.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think the other thing that strikes me about what you said is around trauma, and, you know, the system traumatizing people as well. And that, you know, there's a lot, you know, trauma informed care is a buzzword, isn't it, at the moment? But yeah, what does it really mean in terms of, you know, people coming into hospital and the experience that people have? And I think you've, you know, really highlighted some of that in what you've just said. Another thing I know we've talked about as well is around like pregnancy, haven't we? Particularly in an acute setting rather than a you know, a specialist perinatal mental health setting. So I wondered if we kind of maybe reflect a little bit on that as well.
Yeah, definitely. I've written a book called Autistic Expecting, which is about, you know, autistic people's experiences of pregnancy in inpatient settings. But of course, you know, I observed, you know, lots of pregnant people in my time. And what was really sort of remarkable again to me was the mother and the baby was almost lost again, you know, in kind of patient narrative that was really dictated to by the illness, and the focus on risk. You know, I think when we focus on risk or we focus on symptoms, what we lose is the person. And for me at least, I feel like if we could flip that and we focus on the relationship and we create that mutuality, that it's then when you have that interiority and you're connected to that person's internal experiencing, it's much more easy then to navigate the other aspects like risk, right? Like how do we maintain safety, you know, those things. So I think we need to flip it. And in terms of trauma informed care, again, I think we need to flip it.
It's interesting. I think I think trauma informed care is it's you know, I was thinking about when I worked in prisons, you know, every aspect of the environment in prison is traumatizing, isn't it? So to be able to provide a trauma informed care in a space where all the things that we know cause people, you know, trauma around, you know, lack of control, trust, you know, the way people are spoken to, and then to be able to sort of unpick that and provide trauma informed care is really difficult. But it also links back to what we were saying about person-centered care, doesn't it? And compassion and how we are with people, and you know, that sense of not dehumanizing people when they come into hospital. And I think the pregnancy aspect I know is really interesting to me because, you know, having worked in perinatal services and mainstream services, I think there's something about you know, who gets kind of access to specialist services and who doesn't still. You know, there's many people who are excluded from that specialist service. And I think the lens of pregnancy and perinatal mental health is very much focused on specialist services, but kind of hides what happens when, you know, women don't get access to mother and baby beds, which, you know, for me is tied up often with disadvantage and how unwell people are. You know, certainly I've known a lot of women who've been too unwell to kind of meet the threshold, you know, for perinatal mental health, so have remained on acute wards. And I guess restrictive practice means different thing, doesn't it, as well, in the context of pregnancy as well, and, you know, and motherhood as well, because, you know, restrictive practice can be around things like, you know, being separated from your baby, being having limited contact with your baby, not being able to breastfeed, or you know, have access to sort of not being able to parent your baby, stuff around, you know, things like observation levels. So it's a big topic, isn't it, that I don't think is really talked about enough yet in mental health. And I know we're going to cover some of this as well, aren't we, when we do our workshop. So
yeah, I mean, I know, you know, certainly for me, you know, I was separated from my daughter and I was in an acute unit and I was in PICU units and low secure hospitals. And again, you know, even just in terms of the environment, that there's no space to connect with the baby. You know, in some of the hospitals there was no family room, and oftentimes she might drive the hour or two, you know, to come and visit me with my mother, and then the ward's too unstable for her to come on to the ward, you know. So I think again there's that sort of environmental you know, kind of issue, and you know, one of the hardest things for me was having to stop breastfeeding like that. And the pain that's associated with that.
Of course.
Discussion about that. There was no discussion about that. And then, you know, being restrained or not having access to being restrained prone. It was, you know, it was in 2014, 2015, you know, on my breasts and the agony of that. And then not having the sanitary products, you know, in terms of breast pads, you know, to manage the excess milk, you know, all of those things. And even now it's, you know, it's very, very, even just thinking about it, it's very sort of traumatic to sort of go back to that, because those are all things that have never been discussed, talked about. And again, I can only assume it's because the focus is never on that aspect of your identity.
And something about institutional thoughtlessness as well, I think, with some of that, like not recognizing the impact that some of those things are going to have. And again, you know, thinking about some of the women that I've supported in prison who were separated from the babies and, you know, still wearing their, you know, maternity clothes when, you know, not having access to the clothes that don't remind them that they've just had a baby. And as you say, producing milk, but being separated from the baby. And every time, you know, mum's lactating, thinking that, you know, they're not with the baby. And it's these small things, isn't it, as well, that I think.
Vanessa, there's something about the grief of that as well, the bereavement of not even anyone suggesting maybe you could express.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Like none of that stuff was talked about. Like now, obviously, you know, having reflected on it in my book and looking back at it, I'm like, oh, that was terrible. But at the time, it was just this grief, you know, that I'd missed the opportunity, those months, those extra months of bonding that I would have had.
It's awful. And, you know, I'm sorry that you've had that experience, but you're not alone, are you? And I'm sure
that's the awful thing.
You know, but that's also why it's important that you are speaking out about these things, isn't it? And that because a lot of women haven't had that opportunity to, you know. And I know, I remember doing this poetry workshop in prison with some of the mums, and you know, it was lovely because it kind of culminated in a book, and they were able to share some of the poems about their experience. But what I'll always remember really is some of those women saying to me that it was the first opportunity that they'd had since they were in prison to talk about being a mum, and that they felt that they'd lost that identity. And, you know, I'll never forget that, actually. Some of those, you know, stories that I heard then, it's so powerful, isn't it? And it's such, you know, a human right, isn't it? To, you know, to be a mum and have a family. It is a human right. It's part of the Human Rights Act. But, you know, we don't talk about the Human Rights Act as much as we should do. We talk about the Mental Health Act, but the Human Rights Act, you know, supersedes the Mental Health Act, doesn't it, really? So, Nicky, I'm wondering if we should come over to you. Sorry, I know we've got deep into conversation.
I'm typing up. I can barely keep up with you two. I think we're covering some real conversational ground. I think it's really interesting, isn't it, how inflexible systems can be. Like when somebody is pregnant, you know the next step, you know what's going to happen next. So you'd think that people would think ahead. We need to have these conversations, or we need to start planning because we'll have a baby, or we'll be breastfeeding, what we're going to do. But it's almost as if we're institutionally locked. You know, like nobody does that here. So we aren't prepared. And then you can imagine, I haven't been on wards and been like war managing and things like that, knowing how hard it is to order stuff off the supply chain. Of course people are going to need to express. Of course people are going to need the sanitary protection and care that you were talking about, and none of it should have been a surprise. I wonder if, and also that idea as well, I think Alexis has been extremely generous in thinking compassionately about people trying to provide care, because nobody really sets out to mess stuff up this badly. but that's no comfort to people who've been through it. And I wondered, having this distance now, and also having, your experience with the Restraint Network, and trying to shift a behemoth system, what do you think could be and should be being done differently?
Good question.
Honestly, Nicky, I think we just need to prioritize the relationship. I know it sounds really simple. It sounds really simple. But I just think that if staff hadn't focused on all of those aspects of things that they thought that were wrong with me, and if they weren't consumed with risk, and if they weren't consumed with being reactive, and if they were proactive, and, if a couple of them had gotten to know me, they would have realized that I wasn't the monster which they were turning me into, and which they did turn me into, but, after a few years, I was, well, not even a few years, a few months, really, I was just in this cycle of overload, restraint, seclusion, overload all day, every day. And that didn't need to be, and actually, when I look back at it, Nicky, I just sort of questioned whether I actually needed to go in hospital in the first place. It was sold to me as a 72-hour rest. And being a new mother, I thought, fantastic. Exactly what I need. I need to be in a hospital where people can care and support me. 72 hours, I'll feel a lot better, and then I go home. And 3.5 years later, I was planning an escape to Africa because I'd been sectioned for another year. Wow. And it wasn't going to end there. I was on my way to medium secure. How long would I've been in there? So I was very lucky, I think, to get out, having only been in for almost 4 years.
Wow!
If staff had just built a relationship and got to know me, they would have seen that I wasn't the 6'1", whatever it is they thought I was. Risk.
It's interesting how you just describe it, almost like spiraling up like a whirlwind. How quickly it
I call it a distress coercion cycle. And the thing is that we get stuck in it. And it's not just me stuck in it, it's staff. So I get really distressed. Right. So I'm in a dominant position. Staff are at that point then in a submissive position. So they have to contain me, right? So then they have to get dominant. But the way they get dominant is by making me submissive. And it just escalates and escalates. So how do we stop that? We have to get in there and we have to think, what is it that's going on here? Actually, how is this distress coercion cycle just escalating and escalating? Because I could always escalate one more. The patient will always be able to go one more. The staff will always have to get, and that's how I ended up. That's how people end up in LTS.
So for people who don't know your story, how did you stop and reset it? Because I assume that the system didn't correct itself.
Well, this is what was very funny about it, Nicky. This is, I guess, is the biggest learning, I suppose, from my story, certainly for me at least. Is that I was in a sort of rehab facility in the community. I was sectioned for another year. I thought, I can't do this. I can't carry on. And I was being moved to a medium secure on the Monday, and this was the Friday. And I phoned 2 people who said that they would help me escape as a joke a few months earlier at a dinner party that I'd attended. And we did. So we drove to Dover, went to Calais, etc. Landed in Africa a couple of 48 hours later. And it's an interesting thing. So I'm about to have been transferred, in a cage to a medium secure hospital, right? Because I'm so risky. I landed, and within 2 weeks, obviously there's no psychiatric drugs where I went, and believe me, I wasn't going looking for them anyway. It was very difficult to come off of them. But in my own environment, in a community of people that cared about me, I could set my own schedule. Things were becoming familiar to me. Within 6 weeks, I was back teaching in a prestigious British curriculum school.
Wow. After 4 years in hospital.
Oh, and after I was about to, do you know what I mean? So I'm just like, this is environmental. Some of it, not all of it, not for everybody, right? But I'm an autistic person. That's my primary diagnosis. So what we're talking about here is we're talking about environment, but we're also talking about the opportunity to feel relational safety. Right? And so staff can be like, oh, this is a problem. All of that stuff is a problem. There's not much you can do about it. But what you can do is you can be fucking nice to people.
Yeah.
Get out to swear on here.
Yeah.
You have to be nice to people, and you have
Yes.
to understand their perspective, and you have to sit with them, and you have to go, this isn't great. I know it's not great. I'm so sorry. This isn't great for you. What can I do in this moment that's going to help, that's going to be different, that's, you know, and I don't think, and it's hard to do that actually when you're kind of, you know, when you know, but that's what I needed, and that's what I got when I escaped, and I was back, you know, back teaching and working and with my daughter, and I was there for 5 years
in Africa.
It's such a, you know, if someone told you this, you'd find it hard to get your head around it, wouldn't you?
I know.
But literally, you just left the country. It feels like a mini series rather than like something that would actually happen. It's just, it's so strange.
Well, there's a book, if anyone wants to read it, it's called Unbroken. I wrote a book about
fantastic.
it. We'll be putting another plug for my book. But no, seriously, and I think that would be the same for a lot of people. How do we create a sense of belonging? How do we create a sense of community? How do we create relational safety? Because we can do that. We can make some moves on those things individually. You don't need like everybody to be, you know, you don't need a huge system change for that to happen.
I think one of the things that really strikes me and that I find so interesting is obviously talking to you, having just met you, you're incredibly personable, you know, and that idea that all of a sudden the psychiatric identity overtakes everything. Any achievement, I mean, extraordinary achievements, but even if you haven't, it's not about that. It almost it's like an etch a sketch, it just wipes everything out that took before. And people struggle, I think, to make a human relationship.
To be brave, Nicky. Like we need staff to be brave, because what you would be doing if you take this kind of relational approach is you're actually going against the status quo. Yeah. You know, and it's odd, right? Because most people come into nursing or into mental health because they want to care for people. That's the bit that gets lost so quickly.
Yeah.
It reminds me of like the Felicity Stockwell stuff, you know, about that unpopular patient, that idea that it's much easier to be nice to somebody who makes you feel good about yourself. Yeah. You know, so if somebody is grateful and they smile and they say, oh, you're such a great nurse, and they get better. Yeah. Then all of a sudden people find it easier to human contact and to actually just open up and actually have a real relationship. But as soon as you get that feeling uncomfortable, and it's nobody who comes into services duty to make staff feel competent or good about themselves, but I think sometimes when staff don't have proper mechanisms to reflect, they don't have support, you get caught up in these spirals of fear and shame and guilt and withdraw. You withdraw from people who frighten you, you know, and there's no, it's not an excuse at all, but it's a way of trying to understand why people just didn't see you, because they're just too the stakes too hard for them to look, maybe.
Well, and I think that it ends up with like what I've come to call sort of like perverse relating, which was like they couldn't see all of me. They're objectifying a part, right? So when I would get overloaded, I felt fear myself. Staff are feeling fear and anxiety as well. And so we have this shared intensity of emotion, which is being shared, right? And that's the bit that gets mirrored back to both of us. And the rest just gets lost. And we come to relate to each other in what I was describing earlier, that domination submission relationship, which flips. You know, when I'm enraged, I'm dominant. You know, when I'm settled, and at no point is there any opportunity for mutuality. Adult
interaction.
It's really worrying, isn't it? That you can understand how something like that happens once, and then everyone takes a step back and goes, oh my God, did you see just what happened? But what you're talking about is years of this really clear pattern just continuing, and nobody stopping, and nobody putting the brakes on, and nobody having the space, the time, or the understanding of how to reflect, see it, stop, do something different.
I suppose what's worrying about it as well is the sort of direction in nurse education to kind of not focus as much on the sort of relational practice, which was certainly, you know, the way I was trained. So I suppose if we're going to take that out of the system even more, then, you know, it's just really concerning, isn't it? Because I think thinking about, you know, when I practiced as a nurse, even if you have to do something restrictive to someone, like, you know, stop them from leaving because you know, concerned that they're going to harm themselves, for example, you can still do it in a human way, and you can still find ways of giving people control, even in those circumstances. And it's that as well, isn't it? I know I bumped into somebody a few years ago now, but I've always remembered, and, you know, I looked after her, and I can't remember the interaction I had with her when I looked after her, but obviously it was significant to her. And she said to me, you know, even when I was detained and I was trying to leave and I was disturbed, you know, when I calmed down, Vanessa, you talked to me about fashion and, you know, just normal things, and it just made me feel human. And I've always, you know, kept that with me. And I just think those things are important, but maybe when you work in the system, you don't appreciate that. But it's about having that empathy, isn't it, and understanding and being able to relate to people as humans. Because it could be, you know, any one of us could end up in a, you know, mental health ward. We've got to kind of, it's the whole them and us thing, isn't it, about not othering people and accepting that, you know, we've all got mental health. We could all potentially be in that situation. And, you know, certainly I've known nurses that I've worked with over the years who have been in mental health settings. But that goes back to what you were saying, Nicky, about the popular and unpopular patient, because again, when nurses who end up in services themselves and are able to, which I would be a nightmare, absolute nightmare, but it's like that sense that they're not going to be compliant patients, because they're going to know the rights and they're going to assert the rights and they're going to question things. And then that leads to that spiral that you've just talked about, Alexis, doesn't it, around control, I think. And again, you know, I've certainly saw that in prisons as well. Very different if a very middle class educated prisoner came in and was kind of questioning the system. They probably had a much worse experience than somebody who was very kind of compliant within the system.
Yeah, I mean, I was a teacher, right? So don't hold it against me, but I was like, don't tell me what to do.
Yeah, exactly.
What do you mean I can't go through that door?
Yeah.
What do you mean I can't leave? You know, how dare you? Don't speak to me like that. You know.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, you're getting irate, and then the beep 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 beep. You know, and it's like, oh.
Yeah.
I wonder if another thing is. Sorry, you were going to say something. I interrupted you.
It's all right. You can go first.
I was just thinking about. I wonder if one of the things that staff don't realise until it's reflected back to them by somebody who is really articulate, how rude they're being sometimes.
Yeah.
I mean, they get used to it. They just get used to talking and saying, oh, you can't go through that door. Instead of saying, we keep that door locked because of safety, or just the sort of thing that you would do to explain or help somebody understand who didn't know. And that staff get used to these kind of like almost rudeness, isn't it? They get brutalized by the system they're in, and then when someone puts it out to them, they're actually kind of embarrassed, and that's one of the reasons they react. And like it's up to us to actually hear ourselves, you know, and we don't always. We get so used to saying the same thing. We don't hear how we're talking or the tone of our voice, and I find that quite.
I think that
it's disturbing, but it's really sad. That misuse of power, isn't it? Stuff that really always strikes me is what I call them towel nurses, people who make people wait for the towel. So you've got a towel there, someone's asked for a towel, give them the towel.
Yeah.
I'll be with you in 1 minute. If there's no reason for someone to wait, just do it straight away. And also I've noticed the kind of like, you know, when you have like the keys or the fob or the card on like a little swingy thing, walk along swinging it, like, and you're just like, I understand that it feels nice to swing stuff around like a little yo-yo, but how does it feel to somebody who doesn't have the power to go through any door they want to? And like, we can be really, really thoughtless about how to manage power with such a lack of grace and such a lack of kindness. It really worries me that we've got that sort of thing wrong. Like, if we can't do manners, I mean, like, okay, maybe you can't dig into your soul to be genuinely a kind person, but you can be polite, surely, to goodness. Surely. I find that really strange. I've got a couple of questions. Are you okay for some open questions? Don't worry, I scan them for anything that's too. So the first one is, and actually there's people saying how sorry they are, some of their students, how sorry you've had this experience. And one of them was saying, do you feel that things would be better now? Because obviously you have this very up-to-date knowledge of what it's like through the restraint reduction. Do you feel that things would be better now versus then? Is one question. And the other one is, after going through everything you did, why did you come back as a psychotherapist? Which I think is a blunt but quite sweet question.
Good questions.
Why don't you just run and keep going? I think that's what they were.
Sure. No, on the first one, I don't think they are better. I think they're getting worse. Even just this week, the idea that we're going to have work coaches, I can't imagine of being in the state that I was in and then being asked to have a work coach. I can't imagine that. I think nurses have less time. I think HCAs have less time. I think there's fewer resources. I think, people are worn out. People are ground down, especially post-COVID. And, I see fewer resources in the community. Yeah. So it's taken me, I applied for some therapy 2 years ago through the NHS, and it's taken 2 years. And I've not had any. It's taken 2 years. God. So I think there's less. It's less responsive, and certainly not proactive.
Yeah.
Why psychotherapy? I think I wanted to understand what happened.
Yeah.
And psychotherapy is a very deep dive. It's very self-indulgent, actually. It's a deep dive into, the mechanics of relationships and what's gone on. And so I have a very comprehensive idea now of what went on, especially in, what I call solitary confinement, because it was the absence of meaningful human contact. It meets the definition. Because I feel like there's a part of me that's lost that I'll never get back. Like all of that sort of, acceptance, love, trust has like been fractured off, and my sense of self is really diminished. I sort of refer to it as like a bit of a hole in my soul. And understanding why I can't feel that, why I can't feel love anymore, why I can't feel joy, why I can't feel happiness. And I now understand that that's, that part of me is actually quite far away. And while I might have moments of it, it doesn't sit with me all of the time. So that's something I hope to get back, over the decades, hopefully, that follow in my life. So that's why, and also, just the opportunity, I suppose, to sit with people in the shit. Nobody, often in solitary confinement, I was sitting next to my shit, literally. There wasn't a toilet. I have to sit there for hours, and nobody was willing to open the door and come and sit in the shit with me, metaphorically as well as literally. And the opportunity to do that for somebody, to accept all of them, even the stuff that's really hard and really difficult and really fear-inducing and really anxiety-provoking and deep emotions. I might feel hate, or I might feel difficult emotions, but the opportunity to sit with that with somebody and to hold them, I think is really it's profound, and it's a gift, actually.
Yeah.
I think there's so many parts of your story that are really shocking. And I guess one of the things that stands out is it's quicker for you to train to be a psychotherapist than to get therapy on a waiting list. That's just...
Well, it took 4 years, actually,
4 years.
to be a psychotherapist. I was doing a master's, but, well, and, various things leading up to it. But it's shocking to me that I am well educated, that I can advocate for myself, that I do have, really wonderful NHS staff, that are, reasonably high up in the system behind me, saying this lady needs this lady deserves this, actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it still took 2 years. It took 4 appeals to the Oates panel.
Wow.
And it always makes you think, what happens for those people who don't advocate, who can't advocate, who don't understand the system? I find it really stressing.
And don't have advice. Yeah. Well, we don't hear their voices, do we? So, if this was your experience with some of the advantages you had, it's kind of striking how many people without those advantages will have experienced similar, if not worse.
Well, what worries me, Vanessa, is with the changes to the Mental Health Act, the removal of learning disability and autism as criteria for treatment under Section 3, which nobody should be warehoused in a hospital, right? So I'm not advocating for that. Nobody, right? Especially, people that have a learning disability or autistic. It's not okay. It's not okay. It shouldn't happen, right? But if somebody, due to a lack of community support, which arguably was what happened to me, a lack of agile, timely community support, is exhibiting distress behaviour, which is considered a harm to themselves or to others, if we cannot understand that medically, and again, I'm not suggesting that we should, but if we can't, and it's an emergency, the only way we can understand that is criminally. And, you know, and this is something that I think we all need to be worried about. Actually. We all need to be thinking about, because it you know, we're going to likely see spikes in homelessness, spikes in suicide in the LDA community, but also criminalisation. And nobody's looking at those numbers with any rigour. You know, if and when this well, it will be enacted.
But I think even without the sort of reform of the Mental Health Act, you know, again, you know, thinking about working in prisons, although this was anecdotal evidence, there was certainly a rise in the number of people being convicted or remanded in custody when, you know, as soon as you met them, it was obvious that they had significant mental health difficulties and should never, ever be in a prison environment. And some of that's about misunderstanding in the court system about people who are vulnerable, and thinking, well, actually, there are no services. So if we, you know, send them into a prison environment, they'll get seen, you know, quicker, not recognising what a prison environment's like and the limited resources around mental health support. So, and then on the other side, like you've mentioned about the homeless, you know, homeless people coming in and out of prison, because obviously they get bed, they get food. You know, a lot of people who've been in the care system who can kind of replicate sort of parental figures in prison that they've been used to in the care system, and that whole cycle of, you know, people being in prison, and of course, you know, people committing serious crimes because they haven't had that mental health support, and things escalate and escalate until, you know, somebody does commit a serious crime and then ends up in the, you know, in the system. And people with disabilities as well, you know, it's another one, isn't it, where you know, people with disabilities who are not getting access to support and end up almost protesting through committing a, you know, usually quite a minor crime, but then that leads to people being, you know, being in prison, and, you know, I guess poverty as well, you know, that sort of intersection of poverty, mental illness and trauma as well, and drug and alcohol as well. And I suppose we've separated off, haven't we, mental health services from you know, drug and alcohol services in most places around the country. So there isn't that same sort of dual diagnosis approach, is it? Because a lot of drug services no longer sit within you know, NHS trusts. So there's that separation when obviously a lot of people who use drugs or alcohol are self-medicating against trauma. So yeah, so there's so much we could say, isn't there?
I guess time's really marching on as well, so we're going to have to find a way of somehow, we've talked about so many different things, but try pulling it all together. And maybe I love the idea that the actual solution, all this sadness, all this horror, is actually just to have human contact with each other and try to understand each other better, and actually genuinely care about each other, not professionally treat people, but actually hear and connect to people, and actually pay the price for that cost, because it is, exactly as Alexis was saying, it's an honor to do it.
It really is.
You need to get that back, you know, that understanding.
It is a privilege, isn't it? And to just be with somebody, as you said, Alexis, and just kind of just be there with somebody. We can't underestimate what a difference that can make. It isn't necessarily, you know, a CBT intervention that's needed. Sometimes just kind of being human and sitting with somebody and having that therapeutic relationship, and, you know, relating to somebody like a human being. These are the things that matter, and that's kind of what you've highlighted for me really in this conversation. And
isn't it? I think between caring, you know, for people or caring about them.
Yeah, that's true. So we're coming to the end, unfortunately. I'm thinking how we can sum this up, but I guess first and foremost, I really appreciate your honesty, because, you know, it is a traumatic story, isn't it? And, you know, I really appreciate that you've taken the time to share that with people listening. But I think it'll resonate for people, and it's a powerful story, isn't it, that needs to be heard, in terms of maybe shocking people into thinking about some of the issues that we've talked about and the impact that those issues have. So I guess before we finish, we usually ask our guests if you want to give any sort of takeaway messages for people who are listening tonight.
I think for me, don't be constrained by what's around you. Just focus on that moment by moment opportunities for that deep kind of meaningful connection, and it will impact the person much later on.
Yeah.
You know, it will impact them positively. You know, there's a half a dozen experiences that I had in my 4 years which have been life-changing, and they continue to bring me great comfort.
Yeah. It's profound. Yeah.
Yeah, good place to finish, I think. If there's anything else we can say that will be more important than that?
No, I don't. But yeah, thank you. And for people who are listening, I know we've touched on some quite difficult subjects, and you know, we are around. You know, we're happy to, you know, respond to any messages or tweets. We'll keep an eye on social media later. Alexis, you're on X as well. I hate calling it X, but yeah, we'll keep an eye on the Twitter tonight. And thank you for listening, everybody.
Thanks, Alexis.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.